Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to get you ready for Week 9 fantasy football. We're going to hit on some start-sit scenarios, especially at quarterback. We'll try to sort through some crowded wide receiver cores, and we'll check to see if there's some sneaky help potentially in a couple of backfields. But first, we got to talk about a couple of impact quarterback situations. And Jared, I think we have to start with the Colts because they switched from Anthony Richardson to Joe Flacco this week. We have already seen these Colts, obviously with Richardson and with Joe Flacco, for nearly 3 full games this season. And there have been some stark differences for Colts receivers between these two quarterbacks, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, at least as extreme as the Browns going from Deshaun Watson to Jameis Winston, if not more extreme. Because, with the Browns, we went from pass-heavy, crappy quarterback play to pass-heavy, fine to, good quarterback play. The Colts are gaining a ton of pass volume and they're gaining passing efficiency. If we look at the 2 full games that Flacco started, 41 pass attempts per game in Flacco's 2 full games. That's up from 26.7 in the other 6 Colts games. So you're talking, over 14 more pass attempts per game. And then the Colts passing yardage, 269 yards per game with Flacco, 175 with Richardson. So, almost 100 more passing yards per game. Josh Downs has been the biggest beneficiary of Joe Flacco so far. In Flacco's 2 games, Josh Downs has 21 targets and 16 catches. He's 6th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game in those 2 Flacco games, 14th among receivers in actual PPR points per game. Michael Pittman hasn't seen as big a boost with Flacco so far. He has 13 targets, 8 catches in those 2 Flacco games. He's 34th among receivers in PPR points per game with Flacco. I would expect that gap between Downs and Pittman to close. I think Downs is the better fantasy bet going forward. I don't think the gap will be that wide. So I do think Pittman, even though the production hasn't been awesome with Flacco, I think he's a pretty big winner from this change as well.
Yeah, I think the one key thing to remember is it's only 2 full games, plus most of a third. So that's a small sample, and certainly there's room for that gap to close. I agree with all that. Of course, we can't just have nice things this fantasy season. So both Josh Downs and Michael Pittman started this week by missing Wednesday's practice. So that means we're going to have to watch and see just how comfortably we can start them this weekend. But if they are healthy by Sunday, it certainly looks like it should be a good spot to start either guy. And the QB switch makes it nicer to have either of them on your team.
Yeah, both guys sat out last Wednesday's practice too. Pittman does have that back injury, which I think seems more serious than the toe thing Downs is dealing with. So that's another reason to prefer Downs going forward. But both these guys have good matchups on Sunday night. The Vikings are 30th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. They've been worse against slot receivers than outside wide receivers. That's Josh Downs playing mostly in the slot. So again, Downs the better play this week, but I think Pittman will be starting for most fantasy teams as well.
We'll be watching both players and updating in Shark Bites throughout the week and the rankings as needed, of course, as we do with any players who need it every week. On to Green Bay, where the Packers may or may not have Jordan Love. He also missed Wednesday's practice, just like the Colts receivers we talked about. But Jordan Love said afterward he has a realistic chance to play against the Lions. Now, this is one we're going to have to watch throughout the practice week. There's a chance Jordan Love could play even if he doesn't practice this week. But I don't think the Packers are going to put him out there unless he is mobile, dealing with a groin injury. So obviously that's the big question. Malik Willis has played better than I think anybody could have reasonably expected this year, but there's still a big difference for Packers wideouts with and without Jordan Love, right?
Yeah, these numbers in Willis's 2 starts are so absurd. I had to double check that they were right. But in Willis's 2 starts, the Packers have been minus 21% pass rate over expected, a 22% neutral pass rate, a 29% pass rate overall. Those are I don't know, like Army college football, where they just run the ball 90%. It's tough for any receiver to produce in that environment, right? It was 33 total pass attempts in Malik Willis's 2 starts. Now, this matchup's interesting because we've talked about the Lions being this pass funnel defense. They're so good against the run. Most teams lean pass against the Lions. Lions are currently favored in this game, so there's a chance that the Packers fall behind and have to throw more. But still, it's tough to trust any of these wide receivers if it does end up being Malik Willis under center.
Yeah, so we'll watch this throughout the week, but I would plan on not using my Packers wideouts if it's Malik Willis, and then playing them as normal if it's Jordan Love. And of course, we'll have to react to exactly how he looks heading into the game with updates throughout the week. Amari Cooper showed up as one of the buys in our Week 9 trade targets article. Came out Wednesday like it does every Wednesday. I wrote that one up, but it was your initial suggestion to buy Cooper. Jared, the case against Cooper right now is pretty obvious. He's been with the team for 2 games. He has been outproduced and outplayed in terms of route volume by both Khalil Shakir and Keon Coleman. So what is the case for buying Cooper right now?
In many cases, it's been 2 games with a new team. I mean, wide receivers, it's tough for these guys to assimilate to new offenses during the season with these in-season trades. Now, Cooper did go from a 34% route rate in his Bills debut to 66% in week 2, a big jump. I would expect another jump this week. Even this week, he might be to like full playing time, which I would expect to be, 80, 85% of the route. So for me, it's just like I expected Cooper to get off to a slow start like this with the Bills. And if his owner is worried, and most Amari Cooper owners are probably in a bad spot right now, right? Because he's just been pretty much useless outside of like one game this season. So I think there's a chance you could pry him away pretty cheaply right now. Give that owner some maybe more immediate help, someone that looks better in the short term. But I think, Cooper, especially as we get into the final couple months of this season, is definitely someone that's going to help fantasy teams.
He might be one of the most easily buyable guys that we've had in that section this year because, like you said, he hasn't done much this year to show us the ultimate ceiling that you would be giving up by trading him away. But he's given us plenty of weeks that don't help your team win and might have cost you fantasy matchups. So good guy to go after. You don't overpay for him because it is still a new situation. And even the Bills, I'm sure, are figuring it out exactly what the playing time is going to look like for everybody, what the target distribution is going to be. I've said plenty of times before, I don't really trust the Bills offensive coaching staff to maximize what they have, but I don't think they acquired Amari Cooper to be their wide receiver 3 behind Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir. So I think we'll see more. We'll continue to see more playing time. We'll see more production. And I mean, you're in the right place to, even if it's uneven, even if it's inconsistent production, Josh Allen is the right quarterback to be with to have those spike weeks at times. Now, we both like the upside on Cooper overall the rest of the way, but how should we treat him this week, Jared? I'm more inclined to go conservative as we see that playing time build up. Like, I think it's going to increase, like you said, but I'm not sure that he's going to play more than Keon Coleman or Shakir this week.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think ideally you could bench Cooper and sort of just make him show you a game, whether it's with the production, whether it's with the playing time before you trust him in fantasy lineups. He's also on the injury report this week with a wrist, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. The Dolphins do have a pretty good secondary. They've been pretty tough against wide receivers so far this season. So I'm with you. I would try to bench Amari Cooper if I can. To me, the biggest concern for Cooper going forward is that Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir seem to be trending up. So if those guys are ready to do more for this offense, you still have Dalton Kincaid there. You still have Dawson Knox running around on like 40% of dropbacks. Like, that's what's keeping these receivers off the field a bit more than we'd like. The Bills still are going with a bunch of 2 tight end sets. So like, that's the biggest concern for me with Cooper, Shakir, and Coleman. I would start both those guys over Cooper this week just because we know the playing time has been there. They've both been productive the past couple games now. So I would lean towards those guys if you happen to be making that decision.
I would too. Cooper obviously has a lot more historical production behind him. They traded for him to, be a big piece of the wide receiver core, but they don't need him to be either. They only gave up a later round pick swap to get him. I mean, it's a decent sized one where they gave a 4th round pick, but it's also not to the point either with that or his remaining contract that the Bills have to play him any certain amount or have to get him any certain number of targets. So it's possible that their younger guys just step up and we get less from Cooper than anticipated. That's why if you do try to go buy him, don't overpay. His old team, Amari Cooper's old team, the Browns, had all their wide receivers, the talk of waiver wires earlier this week, after that big week 8 in the first start for Jameis Winston this year. Now we have to decide who to play among this group and how high to rank the Browns wide receivers for week 9. They've got a home game against the Chargers, Jared. Lead corner Asante Samuel Jr. still out for at least one more game. He is on IR. Christian Fulton, another corner, has been in and out with a hamstring injury over the past 3 weeks. Chargers for the year remain 7th toughest on wide receiver scoring by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. They rate well in DVOA against the pass. What are we doing with Cedric, Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore in week 9?
I think we've been sort of expecting this Chargers pass defense to be worse with those injuries. That hasn't been the case. They've just remained strong no matter who they've plugged in. Which probably says, more about the scheme than the players. This is a much tougher matchup for these Browns wide receivers than they faced last week against a Ravens defense that had been struggling, then was missing 2 corners in that game as well. So we're not expecting any of these guys, Tillman, Jeudy, or Moore to do what they did last week. To me, Tillman's still the first one in, and I think if you added him on waivers this week, you should probably lean towards starting him. Just because of the volume, right? Over the last 2 weeks, Cedric Tillman's 2nd among all wide receivers in targets. He's 3rd among wide receivers in air yards. He's 4th in expected PPR points per game. So he's just getting the volume. As we said, he's playing well. And that that volume should still be there, right? Like I don't see the Browns going run heavy in this matchup. So I think Tillman, based on volume, is a pretty nice like wide receiver 3 play this week.
Yeah, like a fully healthy Nick Chubb might be a candidate for 30 carries in a given game, but this version of Nick Chubb, they're not going to want to hurt him by overrunning him against the Chargers. Cedric Tillman, he's getting the volume. He's a downfield guy, and he's playing with a quarterback who loves to chuck it. So he's just in a good spot. Doesn't mean it's always going to work out, but it can work out anytime. And you did pay up to get him most likely from waivers this week. So you should go ahead and lean toward using Tillman. Transitioning to the quarterbacks, starting with Jameis Winston, this is still going to be relevant to those Browns receivers. The Chargers are closer to neutral as a quarterback matchup by our numbers than they are versus wide receivers. Like I said, 7th toughest against wide receivers, closer to the middle of the pack against quarterbacks. And if you look at the individual QBs that the Chargers have faced, it makes it really tough to evaluate just how good this pass defense is. In order, here are the starting quarterbacks they've faced: Gardner Minshew, Bryce Young, Justin Fields, who completed 25 of 32 passes in that game, Patrick Mahomes, who lost Rashee Rice 4 plays into that game, Bo Nix, who delivered a QB 10 score in week 6 against them, Kyler Murray, who's been up and down and more down than up passing, and then Spencer Rattler and Jake Haener last week. Those two combined for 278 passing yards against the Chargers. So it has been a good defense. I'm not sure how good they are in terms of being able to shut something down. So I started this week saying, I don't know about Jameis Winston versus this one. At this point, I'm like, I wouldn't be shocked if Jameis Winston finished this week inside the top 12 and brought a couple of wideouts with him.
I wouldn't be shocked either. It's Jameis Winston, but let's remember that it's Jameis Winston, and he can have a dud here too, right? Like, yep. I know it's easy to fall in love with him after what we saw last. I think what's fair to say though is, again, this is a tougher matchup for Winston than what he faced last week in that banged up Ravens secondary. The Browns are implied for 20.5 points. That's tied for 21st on the week. Now, they weren't implied for much more than that, if they were even implied for more than that last week. So I'm not saying that's like a deal breaker for Jameis. He's 17th in our quarterback rankings right now. So like I think most teams in 1 quarterback leagues probably have a better option. But again, if you're in a deep league or in a 2 quarterback league, Winston's just fine. The upside's definitely there. Let's just remember that the floor is still lower than a lot of other guys in that range.
Right. The upside's there. So is the downside. So, I mean, if you want to take that shot, go for it. He absolutely could outscore any number of guys ahead of him on the list, to be honest, but he could also, I don't know, underscore the guys behind him, however you want to say that. Patrick Mahomes, we have talked about a few times on these preview shows, and it's always focused on how low to rank him in a given week. But now he is 6th in our QB rankings for week 9. Facing the Bucs. What's going right for Mahomes now?
Yeah, I think this is the get right spot for Mahomes. And not to say that he's going to, be a top 6 fantasy quarterback the rest of the season. I just think this week it's a great spot for him against this Bucs pass defense. Tampa Bay 29th in our adjusted fantasy points allowed as quarterbacks. Over their last 4 games, they've allowed 509 yards and 4 touchdowns to Kirk Cousins. Then they faced Rattler and the Saints, gave up 243 in a score. Then Lamar Jackson, 281 and 5 touchdowns. And then Kirk Cousins again, 276 and 4 touchdowns. So just 3 massive games allowed to passers over their last 4 outings. The other thing with Mahomes too, and this is both for this week and going forward, he is due for some positive touchdown regression. The Chiefs have just 8 passing touchdowns so far this season. They have 10 rushing touchdowns. It's rare for teams to have more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns. Generally, it's like a 2-to-1 split in favor of passing touchdowns. So I just think more touchdowns are going to come from Mahomes' arm and fewer to Kareem Hunt on the ground going forward. And I would expect that flip to start happening this weekend.
So you mean to tell me that Kareem Hunt's rushing is not better than Patrick Mahomes' passing?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I'd play Patrick Mahomes very easily over Jameis Winston this week. Wouldn't be shocked if Winston scores more points, but if you have Mahomes, this is the week that you have him for, and then we'll go from there. Matthew Stafford gave us QB5 numbers in week 8. This week, he is at Seattle, which is the 6th best QB scoring matchup by our numbers. Jared, what are we doing with Matthew Stafford for week 9?
Yeah, I like Stafford more than Jameis Winston as a spot starter. Stafford, even right now, he's behind Bo Nix and Caleb Williams in our week 9 rankings. I might even lean towards Stafford over those guys. It's close. But we've seen Stafford now, 2 games with Cooper Kupp and like Puka Nacua for at least half of the game. Back in week 1, he left around halftime. But in those 2 games, Stafford has finished quarterback 13 and quarterback 6 in fantasy points. I'm kind of just throwing out what he did in between those spots. He just didn't have much of a chance without his top 2 wide receivers. Like you said, Seattle, a good matchup for quarterbacks. Devin Witherspoon, their stud slot corner, did not practice on Wednesday, so we'll keep an eye on that. That'd obviously be a big upgrade for Cooper Kupp, especially. And then the Rams have a 25-point implied total. It's 10th highest on the week. So there's a lot of factors favoring Matt Stafford as a starter this week.
Yeah, you got to like the spot. He is basically high floor Jameis Winston, I think. And, you can look in our rankings. We definitely make sure to set these guys in specific order. We weigh guys versus each other. But there's usually not a whole lot of difference between like QB 13 and QB 17 or 18. So if you're looking at somebody in that range and he is several spots below the other option on your roster, but you're like, Matthew Stafford just had a really good week last week, I'm really feeling it, go for it. Don't let the rankings, necessarily set who you're putting in your lineup. Look at them. If there's a huge difference, then yeah, we would go for the higher guy. If they're close to each other and you want the one that's a little bit lower, go ahead and make that move because it's your team at the end of the week. Bo Nix, you just mentioned in passing with Matthew Stafford, is at QB 12 in our rankings. I could see, Jared, people being like, yeah, Bo Nix was great last week, but it's the Ravens. Some matchups are deceptive depending on which numbers you look at. And I hold up Miami as an example, because if you look at our adjusted fantasy points allowed, they're the worst QB matchup in the league, but they're 23rd in DVOA. And it's not that it's a good defense. It's just that nobody needed to pass against them, relatively speaking, while Tua was out. So passing volume was way down. Production was way down. And when you compare that production for those quarterbacks versus what those quarterbacks did in other games against opponents that were much better than the Tua-less Dolphins, then it looks like the Dolphins are draining everybody's scoring. That's not the case. Baltimore, however, not a deceptive matchup. They're 25th in pass DVOA. Josh Allen is literally the only quarterback who has fared poorly against Baltimore versus what he's done in the rest of his games. Every single other quarterback has done at least what he's done otherwise this season. Bo Nix sits 12th in our rankings right now. His base projection, though, is actually higher than the 4 guys right in front of him. So, I wonder if we might even be a little low on Bo Nix's ceiling this week, and maybe he should even be higher than 12.
If you just go based on the numbers, everything you said about the Ravens pass defense, how Nix has been producing, right? He's been a top 12 quarterback quite a few times now over the last month. It all makes sense on paper. I do still worry about just rookie quarterback going on the road. It looks like the Ravens are going to get Marlon Humphrey and Nate Wiggins back this week. They were both limited in Wednesday's practice. Those are the 2 starting corners they were without in that game against Jameis Winston and the Browns last week. And the other thing that, I think we should definitely be cautious with Bo Nix is Denver's implied point total this week is 18.75. That's the 4th lowest on the week. Last week, they were up around like 26. They were one of the 5 highest, point projected teams in the NFL last week. So, the Vegas lines were telling us the Broncos are going to score points. This week, they're telling us the Broncos are going to struggle to score points. So that's why Nix sits at 12. Like, you're right. Like, he could sit inside the top 10. He's one of the best spot start options along with Stafford and Jameis Winston.
So Bo Nix sits ahead of everybody but Patrick Mahomes that we've talked about to this point. I think ultimately 12th is a fair spot, because even if the numbers say, yeah, he's set up to have a good week, not everything's numbers. He could throw for 290 yards, and if it's 1 touchdown and he runs for 30, that's not a huge fantasy day. So I think it's good to temper expectations a little bit, especially when you look at what he has receiver-wise. Makes for a good starting option. Let's not get ahead of ourselves off of his biggest week. I never thought that I would get to week 9, Jared, and worry about ranking Baker Mayfield too low. What's the deal with him this week, though? He is outside of QB1 range in our rankings.
Yeah, and betting against Baker has really not worked all season. I think I'm willing to bet against Baker Mayfield one more time in this spot on the road against the Chiefs. That's the Monday night game. The Chiefs 11th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They're 8th in pass defense DVOA. Baker obviously, of course, is still going to be without Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And again, same point here with Bo Nix. The Bucs actually have a lower implied total than Denver. They're at 18.5 implied points, 3rd lowest on the week. I just think the Chiefs defense is really good, and Baker without his top 2 receivers, I'll be super impressed if he has another big game this week.
The Vegas numbers are obviously not always right, but ignoring them, you do that at your own peril. So we definitely take them into account when we're setting these projections. The last quarterback we'll talk about, Caleb Williams, going against the Cardinals. Obviously, it's going to be tough to trust him after a horrible outing at Washington. But Williams' previous 2 games landed him at QB2 and QB6 in those weeks. So, Jared, how many of the guys that we have talked about to this point, just to remind anybody who's watching or listening, that is Jameis Winston, Matthew Stafford, Bo Nix, Baker Mayfield, how many of those guys are you willing to start Caleb Williams over this week?
Yeah, I'm starting Caleb over Baker and Jameis if I have that decision. Again, to me, like Caleb, Bo Nix, and Stafford, that's a tough call. I'd probably rank them Stafford, Caleb, Bo Nix. But again, you can kind of go any order with those 3. The thing with Caleb, and we've talked about this a few times this season, he's been very matchup sensitive. He's been good against bad pass defenses, and he struggled against good pass teams. I know he struggled against Washington last week. That Washington defense has been better. Like, I would not consider them like a bottom barrel pass defense anymore. Caleb has faced 3 bottom 8 quarterback defenses. In those weeks, he's finished quarterback 10, quarterback 6, and quarterback 1. The Cardinals are 23rd right now in adjusted points allowed to quarterback. So they just missed that, bottom 8 range. But again, it's a good matchup for Williams, and he has at least shown he can deliver in these plus matchups.
And the Cardinals have not been a good defense, and they lost pass rush with Dennis Gardeck getting injured recently. So it's a good matchup. There's upside. He's a rookie quarterback, so same kind of issues as with Bo Nix. We're still learning about the guy. He's still new to the league. There's still a chance that he just has a down performance, but it's a great spot. I agree with him being in that range. I can't argue strongly in any ordering of Matthew Stafford, Bo Nix, Caleb Williams. If you have to choose among any 2 of those guys, it's pretty much a coin flip. Feel free to go with whichever one makes you the comfiest. And obviously we'll watch for if there are any other factors in those decisions that should alter the projections by game time. Let's move to running backs before we close out here. And we talked plenty about Baker Mayfield, but the Bucs backfield might be a bit more interesting as a conversation topic right now. Tampa Bay announced both Rachaad White and Bucky Irving among the offensive starters last Sunday. White still played a bit more than Irving for that one, but the usage between them was pretty even. So I guess how are we treating those guys this week and beyond?
Yeah, and Sean Tucker didn't play very much at all in that game last week. It looks like we're kind of close to back to where we were before the Sean Tucker breakout game. Super tough matchup, especially on the ground for these Bucs running backs this week. The Chiefs are second in run defense DVOA. They're allowing 3.0 yards per carry to running backs. They've also just faced the fewest running back rush attempts in the NFL, in large part because, well, 2 reasons. 1, they're so good against the run, and 2, they're often leading. White and Irving, I think, both should do enough in the passing game to be viable fantasy starters this week and PPR leagues for sure. Just look last week, Rachaad White, 5 catches, 38 yards, and a touchdown on 6 targets. Bucky Irving caught all 7 of his targets for 40 yards. We do have White ranked ahead of Bucky Irving. The big reason for me is we still had Rachaad White running a route on 55% of pass plays last week, so just 31% for Bucky Irving. And the Bucs coaching staff even came out and said after that game, they were like, yeah, no, we were behind in that game. We still prefer Rachaad White in obvious passing situations. This could definitely be a game where the Bucs fall behind and are in those obvious passing situations. So I do prefer White as the play this week, but I think Irving, again, especially in full PPR with the pass catching volume we expect, is a decent RB3 flex play.
Yeah, I mean, he had a pretty good PPR week last week with just 9 carries, had those 7 catches. There's certainly room for both of these guys to be reception leaders again this week among running backs. Like you said, Baker Mayfield threw 50 passes last week with no Chris Godwin, no Mike Evans. Would not be shocked if there's a similar game flow this week, especially against that tough defense. So neither of them is inside the top 24, but either of them could wind up inside the top 24 in PPR scoring by the end of the week. Alexander Mattison is going to close things out. As always, the closer. We should have played his intro music before we got into it. We always look at expected production for players every week because we want to find guys that are either potentially due for, a step up or a drop off from the fantasy numbers that they've been giving us to this point. Alexander Mattison has been the starter for the Raiders over the past 4 games. And over that span, he ranks 7th among running backs in expected PPR points per game. Jared, does that make Alexander Mattison a candidate to have a significant impact both on our lineups this week and the rest of the way?
I mean, when you're getting that much volume, I think you're a viable fantasy starter. Do I think he's going to work anywhere close to, RB7 in actual fantasy points the rest of the way? Not a chance. He's 31st in actual PPR points per game over that 4-week stretch. Usually we'd say a guy's going to come much closer to his expected points. I'm not sure that's the case with Mattison just because he's not good. This Raiders running game has not been good all year, whether it's been Mattison or Zamir White. Mattison's averaging 2.7 yards per carry over that 4 4-game stretch. Like maybe that comes up a bit. I don't think it's going to come up a whole lot. I'm considering him an RB3 flex play at this point. Like if he surprises with efficiency and pushes above that, that's nice. But again, I think based on the volume, you can at least plug him in as like a floor option, especially in PPR leagues.
Almost always, if we see a running back with RB7 expected points and RB31 actual points, we're like, God, this guy is about to rebound. But just like you said, we already know Alexander Mattison stinks. We already know the Raiders stink. Is he going to do better than RB31? I guess probably if he gets RB7 usage the rest of the way, but he's not going to be a difference maker. I think there's probably as good a chance that they start working Dylan Lobby in as there is of Alexander Mattison actually winning somebody a fantasy title. So I wouldn't go after Mattison, but like you said, if you have him, he's an option. If you don't like what you have in a given week, you go with the guy who's going to get the ball and hope that he falls across the goal line at some point.
Yeah, it's just sad we're wasting that level of usage on a player and situation that's this poor.
Sad, but at least totally predictable heading into the season. When a team goes in with Zamir White as its lead back and only adds Alexander Mattison and Dylan Lobby, who I'm not even sure if I'm saying his last name right. Maybe I'll just pronounce it differently every time to make sure. But it was very clear heading into the season that the Raiders were going to have a garbage backfield.
For sure. Yep. And Mattison was free in these best ball drafts too. I ended up taking a lot of them. I don't know if I'm going to say I wish we had promoted him more as a late round pick, but yeah, for the price you took him at in these drafts, he's definitely delivering nice value.
Yeah, if you need somebody to give you 8.2 points at the bottom of your best ball roster, you've got your guy. You can find the rankings that we've been talking about for this week, for the week ahead, for the rest of the season on draftsharks.com for various fantasy formats. But the best way to find out who to start in your lineup this week and every week is your team intel page. That applies our weekly projections, including ceiling and floor, to your league's scoring and lineup settings. The result, lineup recommendations that are tailored to your exact situation. So you can spend your week tweeting your 20 favorite fantasy analysts and hope that they answer you on who to put in your lineup, or you can take a couple minutes, check the only tool that fully understands your specific situation, and get your lineup set confidently every week. Team Intel, just one example of how Draft Sharks can be your unfair advantage.